If you have your Bibles and would like to read along as we read the Word of the Lord, we're turning to the book of John, chapter 21 this morning. Following the resurrection of Jesus, there was a period of about 40 days where he continued walking among his disciples and among those who were his followers on the earth. We don't have all of the events of these days recorded. We don't know every single day and every single step, and we don't know everywhere that Jesus went, though it's likely that he went far, far further than we could have imagined during that time. But we do have a few special events which are recorded in the Gospels. So in John chapter 21, Jesus had already met with his disciples 2 times. He was about to meet with some of them for a 3rd time. He had first appeared to the 10, and then he appeared to the 11, including Thomas, and now he appeared before a group of just 7 of his disciples as they were out fishing. And I don't know about you. I've not really had the opportunity to go fishing as much as I want to in my life, but I like fishing. I enjoy fishing. And I understand why the disciples would have had a little bit of a pull towards fishing. I mean, they were fishermen by trade before Jesus found them, but fishing it's something fun to relax and to erase the troubles on your mind sometimes. And certainly during this very confusing time, the disciples would have had a lot of reasons to go fishing. So they were out there fishing on the boat here in John chapter 21. And if you could, let's stand as we read God's Word together this morning. John 21 begins like this. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and on this wise showed he himself. There were together Simon, Peter, and Thomas, called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other of his disciples. Simon Peter saith unto them, I go a-fishing. They say unto him, We also go with thee. They went forth and entered into a ship immediately, and that night they caught nothing. But when the morning was now come, Jesus stood on the shore. But the disciples knew not that it was Jesus. Then Jesus saith unto them, Children, have ye any meat? They answered him, No. And he said unto them, Cast the net on the right side of the ship, and ye shall find. They cast therefore, and now they were not able to draw it for the multitude of fishes. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved saith unto Peter, It is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he girt his fisher's coat unto him, for he was naked, and did cast himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in a little ship, for they were not far from the land, but as it were 200 cubits, dragging the net with fishes. And as soon as they were come to the land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid thereon, and bread. Jesus saith unto them, Bring of the fish which ye have now caught. Simon Peter went up, and drew the net to land full of great fishes, 153, and for all there were so many, yet was not the net broken. And Jesus saith unto them, Come and dine. And none of the disciples durst ask him, Who art thou? Knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus then cometh and taketh bread, and giveth them, and fish likewise. This now is the 3rd time that Jesus showed himself to his disciples, after that he was risen from the dead. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word today. We thank you for this account that was recorded for our benefit today. Lord, we just pray that you'd help us to do our best to lay out what you've put on our hearts today, and help each one here to have our hearts open, our ears ready to hear, and Lord, that we just might glorify you through all that's said and done. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. You may be seated. So this is now the 3rd time where Jesus showed himself to these particular disciples. Thomas had only seen him now 2 times. The others in this group had seen him now for the 3rd time. Jesus had appeared to them 2 times prior, and now some unspecified time has passed for the disciples without having seen him again. It may have been a couple of days, it may have been a week. We don't really know, but we know it was less than 40 days, because at the conclusion of 40 days is when he ascended up into heaven. I would imagine that they still had a lot of questions. They probably even had a little bit of doubt trying to take hold, depending on how long it had been between these visits for them. What we do see here is that there were 7 disciples who together decided that they wanted to go fishing. And we don't know all of the things that they were running through their minds that night, or all of the reasons they had for going fishing. We just know that they went fishing. But as I've been thinking about this passage, it just came to me this way, and it's continued to I guess, nag at me for the last couple of weeks that it seems as if we had a group of disheartened disciples returning to fishing. You know, these were men who had spent their lives learning the trade of fishing. They were called out of that fishing. Jesus said no longer to be going fishing, but now to become fishers of men. But now at this point, when they've seen Jesus, sure, he came to them, he spoke to them, he did some things to prove that he was resurrected again. But wouldn't you think that maybe there would have been a little bit of doubt still settling in? Maybe they just hadn't seen quite enough to be completely sure of it. And some of them maybe felt like it had been a fever dream of some kind. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe they'd been seeing things. They weren't sure what to believe. Or maybe they were just feeling so much guilt over how they had abandoned the Lord that night. But whatever the purpose, they decided they were going back fishing. And they had a lot of reason to be discouraged. This was only the third time that Jesus appeared to them following his resurrection. So they knew he was alive, but they weren't as close to him as they had been before. He wasn't sleeping in the same house with them like he had for 3 years. He wasn't teaching them daily in the temple or by the seashore like he had for 3 years. He wasn't there with them every moment as he had been for 3 long years together. You can't really blame them for being unsure of which way to turn or what to do. We can't really be upset with them for wondering what to do now that things seem to be so different. Because things were very different. They weren't with Jesus the way they had been before. Things were different. Things had changed. I couldn't imagine just the uncertainty that they were facing. I mean, I can almost imagine the uncertainty they were facing. They had went from spending literally every waking moment by Jesus' side, spending every evening for that last week of his life especially, praying in the garden with him, staying in the same home with him, eating with him, listening to his teachings every single day. They had been with him firsthand for 3 years, and now he just came and went as he pleased, and they had no idea where he was. They'd be missing him an awful lot, wouldn't they? Wouldn't you? If you were in their shoes, wouldn't you be saying to yourself, I don't know what to do with myself anymore? I mean, you've abandoned your entire life. You're no longer a fisherman. You're no longer doing what you did before, and, well, Jesus isn't there. So what do you do? Well, the choice they made was one that makes me wonder some things, makes me question some things. You see, Jesus had called them away from the profession of fishing. Most of these, in fact, probably all of these individuals were fishermen. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon Peter, probably his brother Andrew was in the group. Just each one of these, at least several of them, were fishermen. And Jesus had specifically come to them while they were fishing and said to give it up, follow him, and he would make them fishers of men instead. They weren't going to be fishermen, but instead fishers of men from here forward. So they were called away from this, but they were going back to it. Just a little question there in my mind. Sure, they still sailed across the Sea of Galilee from time to time, but they were called to put down their nets and to follow Christ instead, to become fishers of men, to draw men to him. Now that things were not the same, though, they went back to the things that Jesus had called them away from. And I'm not saying that it was a sin for them to go fishing. Not at all. It wasn't a sin for them to go fishing, but they were going back to a life that Jesus had called them out of. And that's a big questionable area in life, isn't it? Whenever Jesus calls you out of a particular way of life, even if it's not necessarily sin in and of itself, when Jesus calls you out of that life, to go back into it is questionable at best, but perhaps sin at worst. They just went back to what they knew. They didn't know which way to turn, so they went back to what they knew. But we don't know how many days had passed between the last meeting and this one. It may have been 1 or 2. It may have been a week. Peter was pretty impulsive. I mean, you take a guess at how long it would take for Peter to get stir crazy and decide he wanted to go fishing. I don't think it would have been too long. I don't think the Lord would have left them very long without having his presence again. But it was enough time that Peter didn't want to sit around any longer. He had to get up and do something. Now, was it because of guilt over having denied Christ? Was he trying to escape his own mind? Have you ever been in a place like that where you have some sort of a guilt hanging on your mind and you're saying, I've got to do something to get away from it? I've got to do something to just get myself busy so that I don't think about... Or have you ever been in a circumstance where the situation around you is so overwhelming that you say, I've just got to go distract myself and do something to get my mind off of it? Maybe that's what Peter was going through here. Was it because he was the kind of person who just couldn't sit still too long? He had to be busy. I mean, we've talked about my father-in-law. He's been a very busy man. He doesn't like to sit still very long. Maybe Peter was the same way. Maybe he thought, well, I'm not walking the seashore, sailing the ships, and feeding these hungry people and going out and doing these things with Jesus. So, I can't do that on my own, so I've got to do something I know. Had to get busy. Perhaps. Maybe it was because they started to think that they needed some money. After all, when you consider that Judas, the one who carried the money for them, who obviously took it to his grave, was gone, they sure didn't have a whole lot to stand on. So maybe they said, we need to make some money. Maybe there were any combination of these reasons, maybe many other reasons, but what we do know is that Peter said, I'm going fishing, and the other 6 disciples said, we're going with you. There was Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, James, and John, and 2 other unnamed disciples. Perhaps John didn't remember, or perhaps they weren't part of the original 12, or perhaps they just in this moment didn't want to be recognized as having been there. We don't know, but there were 2 other disciples. Isn't it interesting how in times when we don't see Jesus' clear leading, we're quick to resort to our own self and what we know? These disciples, they didn't see Jesus' clear leading. They didn't know what was going to happen on the day of Pentecost. They didn't know what their future held. They didn't have the Great Commission yet. All they knew was, even on the day of the Great Commission, they said, are you going to overthrow Rome yet? They still didn't understand what Jesus' plan was. They had no clear leading. And isn't it interesting? They just said, well, we'll just go back to what we know. Instead of taking the time to pray and say, God, lead us, guide us, direct us, show us what to do. We want to know where you want to lead us. No, they said, we're going fishing. Too many times in our own life when we're not sure of which way to turn, instead of turning to God and taking some time to really seek His leading, we say, I'm going fishing. Maybe not literally. Maybe we say, well, we're going to go do this thing that we know. I'm going to go find my own way to supply for my needs. I'm going to go find my own way to get away from the trouble in my head. I'm just going to go and do what I know. I don't know if they were looking to make a profit so that they could survive. After all, they'd become accustomed to barely making it by with the charity from others, but Judas had taken that to his grave. But it's fascinating to me to see them go back to their familiar comfort, even though they were called to leave that behind just 3 years before. I've known a decent handful, and I don't want to name any of them, but a decent handful of individuals who were clearly called into the ministry, who became pastors, who were in even Allegheny churches. And at some point along the line, things got tight. They came into a difficult spot, and they turned back to their worldly profession that they had before they became a minister, and they abandoned the ministry. And 10, 20, 30 years later, maybe even longer, they're still not back in the ministry where God clearly called them to be. I'm not saying God doesn't, in some cases, call someone to be temporarily in the ministry, but I'm saying I'm sure that many of the churches that are unfilled today could be filled if they would have kept on going with what God had called them to do, instead of going their own way instead. And I think that it was a very real risk for these disciples if they would have just went out there in that ship that night and continued to sail on and ignore the voice of Jesus, that they would have went their own way, and, well, the church sure wouldn't be what it is today. Also, though, if God has called you clearly to abandon something, anything, whatever it is, there's never room to go back and test if He's changed His mind on the subject. The conviction He laid on your heart is there, and it should be there to stay. I have had friends who have said, well, we just decided to do this thing to see if God really still cares about it or not. Never do that. They've done it. And you know what? They've continued to go downhill further and further away from God and further away from the things that they were clearly convicted of just a short while before. When God lays a conviction on your heart and you say, I'm going to keep on testing and seeing whether it's really true, you're slowly numbing and dulling your sense of conviction in your heart. And you're slowly, my sister Russell always said conviction was kind of like, we had a conscience. It's like a triangle that's spinning inside every time we do something wrong, and it kind of hurts every time those points hit. But if we let it keep on spinning and we ignore it long enough, we wear those tips off. We no longer feel that convicting power. And eventually, at some point, we're no longer hearing the Spirit speak. Be careful not to go back on things that God clearly told you not to do, or He told you to abandon or to give up. I could go on for hours on that subject alone, but I won't. But a familiar scene unfolds here in this narrative. As the night goes on, the disciples have plenty of time to think to themselves. I don't know what time of the night they would have went out, whether it was when everyone else was going to bed, whether it was really early in the morning, say 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. I don't know. But at some point before daybreak, and for quite a period of time before the sun went up, if you've been a very avid fisherman, I've not been, but if you've been an avid fisherman, you go out before daybreak, because at daybreak, that's when all the best fish bite, right? At least that's what I've heard everyone tell me that knows anything about fishing. But they had been out there in the dark, in their boats. Apparently there were at least 2 vessels. And they were out there on that quiet lake. And if you've ever been out there fishing on a lake, you know what the scene is like. At least with any men who know what they're talking about. Because if you begin to talk, they'll tell you, shh, you'll scare the fish. You get quiet. And these men wouldn't have been out there blabbing and having a good time. They would have quietly been just dragging that net through, trying their best to toss out a little bait, get some fish to rile up. They would have been very quiet sitting out there in those ships that night. And as they were there all night long, never a bite, never a nibble, never a tug at the ropes of the net, it must have seemed like an eternity to them. I can only imagine the thoughts that would have been going through their minds. Imagine feeling the guilt of running away from Jesus' side in the garden. They still hadn't dealt with that yet. Imagine the guilt of knowing that you denied him 3 times by name in the courts of the temple while he was being tried. Imagine having reruns play in your mind of the day that you were called to follow him, and now feeling like you'd failed him and you didn't know where to find him to apologize. At least that's the thoughts that would be going through my mind if I were in the spot of these disciples that night. That's the things I would be thinking of as they sat out there in that over that cold lake. Imagine feeling that way all night long as you sat there with nothing but the sounds of the night in the distance, as the others in the boat have the same weight of guilt hanging on their shoulders. I know that none of the others did exactly what Peter did and went through as big of a denial of him, but they had that guilt of having run from his side and abandoned him in the garden when he was arrested that night. They all knew that it was all of their faults. Not a single one of them was in the right that night. They probably didn't do too much talking, but they did a lot of thinking as they sat in those boats. And I wonder if Peter remembered the last time he went fishing. You see, back in Luke 5, we read how Jesus used Peter's boat to do some teaching. It says, "Now when he had left speaking, he said unto Simon, Launch out into the deep, and let down your nets for a draught. And Simon answering said unto him, Master, we've toiled all the night, and have taken nothing. Nevertheless, at thy word I will let down the net. And when they had done this, they enclosed a great multitude of fishes, and their nets brake." Just imagine that. It's sort of a familiar sight, right? I would think that Peter should have at least recognized that as he's sitting out there on the boat and he's saying, the last time I was fishing, the same thing happened. I didn't catch a single thing until the day Jesus called me out. The night wore on, and suddenly we see that Jesus called from the shore and asked them, "How's it going? Have you got any meat? Do you have any food out there? Certainly you're getting hungry. You've been toiling all night." It probably took everything in Peter to keep from being angry about what was going on as he responded. But the only response we hear from all of them is, no. No, we don't have any food. No, we aren't as good as we used to be at this fishing thing. No, we're pretty helpless because we don't have Jesus with us. But then Jesus did a very Jesus-like thing, didn't he? He gave them a simple instruction that was so easy to follow. It wasn't too much trouble. It seemed a little silly at the time, right? You've been fishing all night. You're the professional fisherman. You've been there. You've been fishing on every side of this ship. I know they've tried every side of the ship. Surely they tried every side. They would have been ignorant not to, but they hadn't caught a single fish in their nets all night long. They worked, they toiled. They found that they hadn't been getting anywhere. So for Jesus to be saying, "Cast your nets out on the right side and you'll catch some fish," it would have seemed like the most silly thing to be advising. Some guy from the shore, what does he know? But I want to let you know that if you try to get anywhere without Jesus, you'll be spinning your wheels the way the disciples were. You're not going to get anywhere. No matter how much you may know about what you're doing in life, no matter how good you may feel about yourself, you won't get anywhere of value when you try to go anywhere apart from Him. Cast your nets on the right side. And it doesn't say they hesitated. They threw their nets into the right side of the ship, and in a moment of time, they felt the net begin to fill. And there was no way those few men could pull the nets in. And so they had to call the second ship with the rest of the men over to try and bring it back to the land. They couldn't even get the net into the boat. They had to drag it all the way back. Isn't that fascinating? Yeah. All night long, they're hopeless, they're helpless, they can't do it on their own. But the moment they obey the words of Jesus, everything just falls into place. Have you been running away from some of the words of Jesus? You know, I have to question. I wonder how long Jesus was calling out to them before they actually heard him. Maybe he was speaking kind of softly at first. I don't know. Maybe these were his first words and they were just ready to hear him. But who knows how long. They were just toiling by themselves, doing it their own way. And when they finally did it Jesus' way, everything just worked. It was then that John knew they were dealing with the Lord. I would imagine that they had all remembered the miracle from Luke 5 in that moment. And Peter threw on his coat. He swam back to shore as quickly as he could. He abandoned the fish because they didn't mean anything anymore. They were just trying to fill the desire of his heart while the Lord seemed to be far away from him. Now that he could have the Lord, that was his only desire. They had an overwhelming abundance of supply provided, but in that moment, Peter recognized that Jesus was back and he didn't want anything to do with the wealth. He wanted Jesus. And that's the way it should be. It should be that whenever Jesus answers a prayer in our lives, or Jesus does something great in our lives, that little thing that is accomplished, it's for his glory. It's great that it happened, but we turn our eyes to him. But you know, too many times, sinners in this world will ask God to provide for them, right? They'll say, you know, I want God to answer some prayers. I'm going through a really tough time. They won't come to church necessarily. They might for a little while. They don't really care about getting saved and abandoning sin, but they'll whisper up prayers to God expecting an answer. They'll ask the church to pray for them. They'll send out those Facebook posts that say, if you send this out, God will provide for your needs, or you'll get $1,000 in your bank account, or something silly like that. But then, if and when he does answer, because sometimes God does answer because the church has prayed, if and when he does answer, they care so much about the provision, they forget about the provider. They care so much about the blessings in life, but they don't care about the blesser. They want the earthly things so much, but they don't want the spiritual things that God provides. They're not seeking God. They're just seeking what benefits they can get from him. And we should never get that way. And Peter was not that way. He was ready to abandon all the benefits. He didn't care because the Lord was back. I think that sort of shows his motive in going fishing that night wasn't one of greed or selfish ambition or anything of that sort. He wasn't going back to fishing because he wanted to make something of himself. He was going back to fishing because he just simply didn't know where else to turn. He wanted the Lord. And when he met with Jesus that night, it was the most precious meeting, as we know from the following verses, that anybody could ever have. It was a time of genuine healing and repairing in their relationship. It was a time where Peter found that forgiveness that he was seeking bitterly that night that Jesus was crucified. Peter abandoned the fish. He put in some extra effort, and when he recognized Jesus was answering, and I think we need to be more aware of Jesus working in our lives and be prepared to put in the extra effort and give him thanks when he does answer our prayers. But when they all got back to shore, it was amazing because they found that he'd already provided. Jesus already had everything set up for them. In verse 12, we read that as they got back to the shore, they found that Jesus already had bread and fish waiting for them on the fire, toasty and ready to go. They found that in all of their attempts to make things work, Jesus already had things worked out. Isn't that amazing? All of our attempts, all of our work, all of our stress and worry over life, Jesus already has the situation worked out for us, if we're tender to follow his leading and to do it his way. Now, he still wanted them to bring the nets of fish over too, but I imagine that the fish he provided was so much better than anything they could bring. 153, it said. Pretty good, but they didn't need that so much as they needed what Jesus had to give. And that's just like Jesus, to have things all lined up. When we obey him, things seem to work out just right and just in the right time. Where did these fish come from? This is another thought I was really questioning. Where did these fish come from? I found a few answers that could be. My first thought was, well, maybe Jesus could have been out there doing some fishing himself. I'd like to think he enjoys fishing from time to time. I mean, He put it in us to enjoy fishing, so I suppose he did too. Maybe Jesus could have had the fish just come flop out on the shore. He could have called out and they would have said, "We're here for your service, Master," laying their lives down for him. I mean, all of his creation will obey. At his word, any part of this world will obey whatever he wants. He says to the fig tree, "Shrivel up and die." It says, "Yes, sir." It's gone instantly. I could imagine that the fish would have just flopped out of the sea for him in that moment. I thought of something a little silly. Maybe he could have saved a piece of fish from that previous meeting where he said, "Do you have any fish?" They had some broiled fish. Maybe he saved a piece of the fish and he multiplied it. Okay, that's a little silly, but he could have done it if he wanted to, wouldn't it? He could have just made them be there, performed a miracle. He could have just had the fish come from nowhere. We don't know where Jesus got the fish, but he got them. He had them ready. And we don't ever know where Jesus brings some of these miracles in our lives and answers our prayers and takes care of our needs and provides for us, but he does. There's no reason to question how. There's no reason to question why, but just to be so thankful to God and to give him the gratitude he deserves. So many times, people give up on praying just on the brink of a miracle. So often people stop seeking God and decide to go another way just when Jesus is ready to provide. I wonder this question. Had the disciples sat by the shore that night and just prayed for Jesus to meet with them, don't you think he would have still had that same meeting with them? Don't you think if they would have earnestly sat at the seashore and said, "God, we just want to see you again," that he would have done it? I think he would have. Don't you think if they would have earnestly sought his presence, he would give his presence to them? They didn't have to go back to their worldly profession. They didn't have to go back to fishing in order to have the provision of Jesus. But in spite of their chasing the fisherman's dream, he still had things ready for them when they came back to shore. He still took care of every need. I don't know who might need to hear some of these things today, but if you have wandered apart from Jesus, know that he has things ready for you. He invites you along with the disciples to leave the worldly ambitions behind, let go of the worldly pursuits, and come and dine at the Master's table today. If you're not where you should be with God in your soul and in your life, know that he's ready for you to come back. His arms are wide open. The bread and fish is waiting on the fire. He's ready to accept you back into his family again. He's ready to give you that salvation back again if you've lost it. He's ready to take you back and to make you what you ought to be. Thank you, Lord. Amen? We don't know how long Jesus was calling out to the disciples before they realized he was there. He may have been softly, tenderly calling them for a while. But as they were caught up in their own thoughts and their own talking, he called to them. How long has he been tenderly knocking at your door today? Have you quieted yourself enough to listen? Have you closed your mouth and opened your ears to hear his voice as he speaks to you? Is he calling on you today to come and to answer that call? Whether it's the call to salvation, a complete consecration, sanctification, a call to do some specific work, or whatever it may be, answer that call today. Come to the Master's table. When we genuinely obey his leading, he provides. Where he guides, he always provides. So don't hesitate to put your trust in him. Give him your life today. Let's stand. Again, if you've been ignoring the voice of God for any length of time, if you felt conviction, maybe it was in these services, maybe it's as you're reading the Word, maybe it's as you're getting alone and getting quiet with yourself and God just speaks to you and you've been ignoring that conviction, don't take it as you're okay just because you're not feeling that heavy conviction on your heart. But maybe that's even more of a sign that you need to come and to pray. But if you have that conviction on your heart, or if you know that you've ignored some light in your life, that God has led you and you've ignored it, come and pray now. Take the time to just lay your life out before him and ask if there's anything that he wants you to do, and do it. Live the way Jesus would have you to live. The altar is open and available. It's ready for you to pray if you have anything to pray over. Whether it's salvation, sanctification, a complete consecration of your life to him, whether it's abandonment of something in particular, whether it's some conviction he's dealing with you on. whether it's light that you've backed up on, whatever it may be, God is here and He's ready to hear your cry as you come and pray before Him.